What's up folks, CrossSG here, back with another Genshin guide. So most of you probably already know that team setup in this game is all about roles and that many characters tend to heavily favor certain roles. There are basically four main roles in a team: the primary DPS, the DPS support, buff support, and heal support. And today we're going to talk about a character who can do equally well in 3 out of those 4 roles, at any constellation level. Her name is Ningguang, and she's a 4-star Geo spellcaster. Now Ningguang is currently a rate up character in the child banner at time of recording, so she is relatively accessible at the moment. Yes, I know, it's kinda late in the banner and we only have a few days left on it. I had planned to have this video out about a week ago, but I got sidetracked by the thunderous adventures of a certain wolf boy. Well, better late than never, right? So going through her kit quickly, her normal attacks fire projectiles dealing geo damage and generates 1 star jade per attack that hits a target. You can have a maximum of 3 star jades at any time. Her charge attack fires a large projectile that deals significantly more damage. It also consumes all star jades Ningguang has, firing each of them at targets for additional damage. Her E skill puts up a large jade screen that blocks incoming range attacks if you're behind it. It also deals a decent chunk of AoE geo damage on the spot that it is cast, and it has a cooldown of 12 seconds. And finally we have her burst, which fires multiple projectiles. If Ningguang has a jade screen on the field when she uses her burst, it consumes the jade screen to fire additional projectiles at targets. It costs 40 energy and has a 12-second cooldown. Now over to her Ascension talents. Her first talent removes the stamina cost of a charge attack if she has any active star jades when she uses the charge attack. The next talent grants an additional 12% geo damage to characters that pass through an active jade screen. And the final talent reveals location of nearby minables. Alright, on to her constellations. Her C1 causes her normal attacks to deal AoE damage. Now lots of folks list this as the game-changing constellation for Ningguang, but I beg to differ. After using her at C0 for about a month, and finally getting her to C1, it was a little underwhelming for me. You see, her normal attacks don't really hit for much, and giving them an AoE effect, while nice, it's not all that game-changing. Now C2 on the other hand resets the cooldown of her E skill if the jade screen is destroyed or expires, with a 6-second cooldown. Now if we're talking about significant constellations, this would be it for me. It not only provides her with more damage but also more energy regen for more frequent burst use. It doesn't change the way she's played all that much, it just straight up gives her more damage output potential. Of course, C3 and 5 add 3 levels to her burst and E skills respectively, and C4 reduces elemental damage taken by 10% if you're within a 10-meter radius of the jade screen. And lastly, her C6 gives her 7 star jades after using her burst. These are the same star jades generated by her normal attack. Instead of 3, you get 7 of them at once after using her burst. Now something worth noting about Ningguang's skills in general is that because many of her skills fire multiple projectiles, the targeting mechanic can be annoying at times, especially if there are too many targets on the field. Now this can sometimes cause her skills to target random enemies in the area, spreading out her damage and making it hard to burst down specific targets. In some instances, particularly when fighting enemies that jump, charge or teleport, if that enemy does those moves while you are charging an attack or just as you activate a skill, it can cause these skills to miss all targets completely, dealing no damage. Yes, this only occurs occasionally, but it does occur often enough for it to be worth mentioning. So what gives Ningguang the ability to take on multiple roles so effectively? Well, that basically comes down to 3 things. First, she is a Geo character. Now Geo can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you don't have to worry about things like which order you cast your elements, or skill chaining and such. But on the other hand, you don't get to benefit from reactions that could boost your damage output because the only Geo reaction is Crystallize, a defensive one. So it's kind of a trade-off, if you get what I mean. And secondly, having a low energy cost burst not only gives her a good burst uptime, but it also makes her a key candidate for buff and regen sets like Noblesse and Exile. And this is what allows her to do very well as a buff or regen support unit as well. And lastly, her skill rotation has very little variation regardless of what role or constellation level you're at. Let's break it down. The first part of her rotation is a normal and charge attack chain, which involves 3 normal attacks followed by 1 charge attack. For convenience, I'll refer to this as the 3-1 rotation from now on. The second part of her rotation is basically her E skill and burst, and there's only one thing to remember about this, which is to always use her E skill before using her burst. In other words, try to always ensure that there is a jade screen on the field when you use her burst. Now let's discuss how her rotation varies between roles and constellations. As a C0 or C1 primary DPS, the rotation would be opening with her E skill and then going straight into 3-1 rotations until her burst is up before popping it. You rinse and repeat this, and that's basically it. Now on the support side, this is much shorter. You simply swap to her, only to use her E and Q before swapping back. From C2 to C5, you now get to cast her E a second time after using her burst. This is because her burst will consume any currently active Jade screen, and C2 will reset the cooldown of her Jade screen once every 6 seconds. So essentially, swap to Ningguang, E, Q, and E again, and then swap back. Now at C6, another step is added to the rotation because now you want to use 1 charge attack immediately after her burst because of the 7-star Jades. So her C6 rotation would look something like this: E, Q, charge attack, and E. That's really all there is to playing Ningguang, folks. It's a simple rotation. Now let's move on to artifact choices, and the only role that uses different artifacts at different constellation levels is the primary DPS. For buff and regen support roles, as mentioned earlier, you want to be in 4-piece Noblesse or 4-piece Exile respectively. Okay, let's look at her primary DPS artifact choices. At C0 and C1, the main set to go for is the Retracing Bolide set, because a large portion of your damage comes from your charge attack. And the only downside is that you need to remember to pick up crystals on the ground to keep the shield up at all times so you get the Bolide buff. Now if you find this a little bit too tedious, a good alternative is 2-piece Petras with 2-piece Gladiators. This provides a damage boost to all skills and attacks. Now at C2 and above, her damage starts to shift more towards her E and burst skills. So as a primary DPS, you now also have the option of using 2-piece Petra and 2-piece Noblesse if you want. At the end of the day, the difference in damage output between all these setups is relatively small. It's really a matter of a little less damage here, a little more damage there, so pick whichever artifacts give you the best stats or suit your playstyle. Okay, on to weapons, and there are a lot of them. So rather than doing my usual weapon progression tier list, I'll just go over some key weapons in each of the star categories and give my thoughts along the way. For 3-star weapons, there are only 2 viable options: the Twin Nephrite and the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. The Twin Nephrite is a chest drop catalyst that gives crit rate as a secondary and increases movement speed and attack after defeating an enemy. Honestly, it's not that great, so you don't have to worry too much if you don't have one. Just basically use whatever 3-star weapon you happen to find. Now the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, on the other hand, is a support-oriented book, and this is one of the best buff support catalysts that is relatively easy to refine. It provides up to a 48% attack boost to the next character that you swap to. The only downside is this literally limits you to just buff support because you won't be doing much damage with this book. Now on to 4-star catalysts. Between the 2 craftables, the Mappa Mare is probably the better weapon for Ningguang, but honestly EM is not very useful for a duo character, so neither of the craftable weapons are actually all that good. Now for the rest of the 4-star options, I'd say there are about 5 to choose from. We have the Widsith, the Solar Pearl, the Eye of Perception, the Black Cliff Amulet, and the Favonius Codex. Now the Widsith has crit damage as its secondary, and provides one of 3 pretty hefty buffs for 10 seconds every 30 seconds. Now it's important to note that only 2 of the 3 buffs are actually useful for Ningguang. And 10 seconds every 30 seconds, that's a 33% uptime, and 2 out of 3 of that basically brings it down to 22% useful uptime, and that's not that great in my opinion. However, this is generally the option that most folks seem to go for, because the damage potential from the crit damage secondary is significant. Next up, we have the Solar Pearl, and this gives crit rate as a secondary and provides essentially a 20% damage boost to Ningguang's entire kit except her charge attack. Ningguang does a lot of damage with her charge attack, so not having that 20% boost to her charge attack, yeah, you're kind of missing out there. However, the Solar Pearl could generally work well with C2 and above because you use her charge attack less often at C2. Next, we have the Eye of Perception, and this can be very powerful if you happen to have it at a very high Refine rank, because it deals up to 360% attack as damage, and it can hit up to 4 enemies every 8 seconds. Now this is particularly useful if you run her as a DPS support, because this means you're pretty much going to proc this at least once every time you swap to Ningguang for a nice chunk of extra damage. Next up, we have the Black Cliff Catalyst or Amulet. Now this is currently offered in the shop for 24 star glitter, and while this is a decent option, as explained in my Noelle guide, I don't think it's worth the star glitter if you have any of the other options. I just don't like the whole buff on kill mechanic on any weapon period. And finally, we have the Favonius Codex, which is the weapon I currently have on my Ningguang. The strength of this catalyst lies in its synergy with Ningguang's kit and how I have built her. With a 40 energy cost, short cooldown burst, using this book at even rank 1 will go a long way to allowing you to use her burst on cooldown. Now, while arguably less ideal if you're running her as a primary DPS, having both team energy regen and strong burst damage support is a very good thing for a support DPS. It comes down to a matter of smaller numbers more often versus larger numbers less often, and I just personally prefer more consistent damage from my supports. And finally, we have 5-star weapons, and yes, I do have a spreadsheet for this because it just does most of the explaining for me. But before we get into the spreadsheet, there's a couple of things to note about the Lost Prayer and the Atlas. Now, because the Lost Prayer's buff is removed whenever you swap characters, I had to assume a very reasonable swap time of 20 seconds. Now, the buff takes 16 seconds to fully stack, so this gives us an average of 16% more elemental damage over the 20-second duration at Refine 1. Now, obviously, the longer you stay on the field, the better, but I had to make some realistic assumptions here, so 20 seconds it is. As for the Atlas, I averaged out the bonus damage over time to a bonus attack value, and that worked out to be 5.3%. So that's what we're going to use. Okay, spreadsheet time. So here are the stats on my Ningguang with the respective weapons. As always, this is my Ningguang. Your mileage may differ depending on your stats. Also, quick note, the DPS values here are relative values, not actual values, and relative values is all we need to compare one weapon to another. Alright, so we have 3048 for the Lost Prayer and 3096 for the Atlas. This works out to about a difference of 1.6% between the two weapons, and I'd say it's well within margins of error, so these weapons are pretty much equal to one another. And of course, I didn't forget about the Memory of Dust. I know lots of you are here for that, so let's have a look. So 3208 for the Memory of Dust. Again, all books are level 80 at Refine 1. Now this gives us about 4% more damage, and I also considered a 100% shield uptime for its bonus. And with these figures, I think it's reasonable to say that in practice, all 3 5-star books are pretty much equal. Yeah, I know, I was hoping for some landslide victory here myself one way or another, but it looks like we have more of the same. Now this isn't all that surprising though. MiHoYo probably has a guy or an entire team with a super spreadsheet going. Now how do I tweak these bonuses to make each weapon unique but generally produce similar DPS values? And that's actually a good thing for game balance if that's how they approach making weapons. Try to make them unique, but try not to make a weapon overpowered. Alright folks, that's it for today's video. I'll leave you guys with some gameplay of my Ningguang as a support DPS and energy battery to my Noelle. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, a thumbs down works too. Share my videos with your friends, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.